The dust-laden wind whipped across Prairie Rose, Montana territory, in the summer of 1876, carrying with it the scent of desperation and hope that seemed to define the untamed West. Penelope Martin clutched her threadbare shawl tightly around her shoulders as she stared at the weathered sign swinging above the general store. Her fingers, once soft and delicate, were now calloused from months of hard travel, matching the hardened resolve in her eyes. "Last stop before giving up," she whispered to herself, pushing open the door that announced her arrival with a protesting creak. Inside, the familiar scents of leather, tobacco, and coffee mingled in the air. The storekeeper, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of a young woman alone, her dress dusty but of unmistakable quality beneath the travel stains. "What can I do for you, miss?" he asked, setting aside his pencil. "I need work," Penelope said, lifting her chin with the remnants of the pride that had once defined her. "Any work." The storekeeper gave her an appraising look. "Not much for a lady such as yourself in these parts. The saloon's always hiring, but no," she cut him off firmly. "Anything else?" He stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Well, there's Mason Zachary's place, about 5 miles north. Lost his wife in childbirth last winter. Got a little one, hardly a year old. Been posting notices for help, but ain't nobody wanting to live that far out with just a man and his baby." "Folks talk, you know," Penelope's heart quickened. "A child." The word came out softer than she intended. "Yep, little girl, he's managing, but only just. Proud man, Mason is, good rancher, fair employer from what I hear." She straightened her shoulders. "I'll take it." "Can someone direct me there?" The storekeeper raised his eyebrows. "Just like that. Don't you want to know what it pays?" "Will it include room and board?" "I expect so." "Then it's enough," Penelope said with finality. After what she'd escaped, any port in the storm would do. 2 hours later, Penelope found herself walking the final stretch to the Zachary ranch, having been given a ride partway by a farmer heading in that direction. The property came into view gradually, a modest but solid-looking house. A large barn, corrals, and outbuildings spread across a gentle slope with mountains rising in the distance. Cattle dotted the grasslands beyond, and horses grazed in a nearby paddock. As Penelope approached, the sound of a baby crying reached her ears, followed by a deep male voice attempting to soothe the child. She hesitated at the edge of the yard, suddenly aware of how forward her actions might seem, arriving unannounced at a stranger's home. The front door opened and a tall man emerged, a red-faced, wailing infant held awkwardly against his shoulder. He stopped short when he saw Penelope, his expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Can I help you, madam?" he called, raising his voice over the baby's cries. Penelope stepped forward, unable to take her eyes off the distressed child. "Mr. Zachary, I'm Penelope Martin. I heard in town that you were in need of help with your daughter." The man's face changed instantly, relief washing over his features. He was younger than Penelope had expected, perhaps 30, with sandy brown hair and a strong jawline partially covered by a short beard. His clothes, though practical, showed signs of hasty dressing and the baby's recent meals. "You heard right," he said, bouncing the crying child ineffectively. "I'm Mason Zachary. This is Emma." He nodded toward the baby, who continued to wail. "She's been fussing all morning. I can't seem to figure out what she wants." Without thinking, Penelope moved closer. "May I?" she asked, extending her arms. Mason hesitated only briefly before carefully transferring his daughter. Penelope cradled the baby expertly, gently patting her back while swaying slightly. "There now, little one," she murmured, her voice taking on a melodious quality. "What's troubling you so?" To Mason's evident astonishment, Emma's cries began to subside, her little body hiccuping with the aftermath of her tantrum. Penelope felt the baby's forehead, then checked her gums with a gentle finger. "She's teething," Penelope said with confidence. "And I suspect she's uncomfortable in this heat. A cool cloth for her gums and a lighter dress might help." Mason stared at her with undisguised wonder. You've worked with children before, a shadow crossed Penelope's face. Yes, she said simply, unwilling to elaborate further. He seemed to sense her reticence and didn't press. Well, Miss Martin, I'd say you're hired if you're willing. The position includes room and board plus wages. It's not much, but it's honest work. When would you like me to start? She asked. Mason glanced down at his now quieting daughter in Penelope's arms and gave a rueful smile. Looks like you already have. That evening, after showing Penelope to a small but comfortable bedroom that had once belonged to Mason's late wife's mother, he sat across from her at the kitchen table. Emma was finally asleep after Penelope had bathed her, fed her, and rocked her with a patience Mason hadn't been able to muster after days of little sleep. I should warn you, Mason said, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, this won't be easy. We're 5 miles from town. Winters are harsh. It's just me, Emma, and now you. I've got 2 ranch hands who bunk in the outbuilding, but they keep to themselves mostly. Penelope nodded, sipping her own coffee. I understand isolation, Mr. Zachary. Mason, please. Mason, she corrected. And I'm Penelope. What brings you to Prairie Rose, Penelope? It's not exactly on the way to anywhere, she tensed, setting down her mug carefully. I'm looking for a fresh start, that's all that matters. Mason studied her for a long moment. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Despite the travel dust and simple attire, there was an elegance to her features: high cheekbones, expressive green eyes, and rich auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. But there was something else. Too a wariness, like a wild animal ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. We all have pasts, he said finally. Out here, it's what you do going forward that counts. Relief flickered across her face. Thank you, he stood, stretching his tall frame. I'll leave you to rest. Emma usually wakes around sunrise. I'll be out with the cattle by then, but I'll try to be quiet. Penelope rose as well. Good night, Mason. As she prepared for bed in her new room, Penelope allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time in months. She'd found refuge, at least temporarily. As long as her past didn't catch up with her, this might be the safe haven she desperately needed. In the adjacent room, Mason lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another adult in the house. Since losing Clara in childbirth, the loneliness had been as much an enemy as the daily challenges of raising a child alone while running a ranch. Having Penelope here filled the house with something it had been missing: not just help with Emma, but a presence that somehow made the rooms feel like a home again. He turned onto his side, pushing away the guilt that accompanied the thought. It was too soon to be thinking such things. But as sleep finally claimed him, Mason couldn't help but wonder what secrets Penelope Martin was carrying, and whether her arrival might be the blessing he hadn't dared pray for. The days fell into a rhythm as summer progressed. Penelope proved herself invaluable, not only with Emma but around the house as well. She cooked meals that made Mason realize how poorly he'd been eating, mended clothes that had been neglected, and kept the house in better order than it had been since Clara's passing. More importantly, Emma thrived under Penelope's care. The baby, who had been fussy and underweight, began to fill out, her smiles becoming more frequent and her developmental milestones arriving right on schedule. She learned to pull herself up and took her first tentative steps while holding onto furniture, always with Penelope's encouraging words guiding her. For Mason, watching Penelope with his daughter stirred emotions he'd thought long buried. She sang to Emma, told her stories, and treated her with a tenderness that Mason recognized as genuine love, not merely dutiful care. One evening in August, Mason returned from the fields to find Penelope sitting on the porch swing, Emma sleeping peacefully against her chest. The setting sun cast a golden glow over them, and Mason stopped, struck by the tableau they created. Penelope looked up, a small smile curving her lips. She wanted to wait up for you, but sleep won the battle. Mason climbed the porch steps, his boots making little noise as he approached. You're good with her, he said, lowering himself onto the swing beside her. Better than I've ever been. That's not true, Penelope protested gently. "You're a wonderful father, you just needed a little help, that's all." He gazed at his sleeping daughter, her chubby cheek pressed against Penelope's bodice. "Clara would have been grateful to know Emma has you." Penelope's eyes softened. "Tell me about Clara," she said. "If you want to, that is." Mason leaned back, setting the swing in gentle motion with one foot. "She was strong, determined. Came out here from Boston because she wanted adventure. Her parents were horrified." A small smile played at his lips. "We met when she was visiting her cousin in town, married 6 months later." "She sounds brave," Penelope said. "She was." Mason's voice grew quiet. "The pregnancy was difficult from the start. The doctor warned us, but Clara insisted on having the baby. Said she'd rather die giving life than live without trying." His throat tightened. "I didn't know she meant it literally." Penelope's free hand found his, squeezing gently. "I'm so sorry." They sat in silence for a moment, the swing creaking softly. "What about you?" Mason asked eventually. "You never talk about your life before Prairie Rose." Penelope tensed, her hand withdrawing from his. "There's not much to tell." "I don't believe that," Mason said softly. "You speak like someone with education. Your manners at the table, the way you fold linens, those aren't skills you pick up on the trail." She looked away, her profile illuminated by the dying light. "Some stories are better left untold." "Are you in trouble, Penelope?" he asked directly. "Is someone looking for you?" Her sharp intake of breath was answer enough. "I won't pry," Mason assured her. "But if you're running from something or someone, I should know if it might bring danger to my door." To Emma. At the mention of Emma, Penelope's arms tightened protectively around the sleeping child. "I would never put her in harm's way," she whispered. "If I thought there was any chance of that, I would leave tonight." Mason studied her face in the fading light. "I believe you," he said finally. "And when you're ready to tell me, I'll listen. No judgment." Emma stirred then, her little eyes fluttering open. She looked up at Penelope, then turned her head and spotted her father. A delighted smile split her face. "Da!" she exclaimed, reaching pudgy arms toward Mason. He scooped her up, his heart swelling as it always did when his daughter showed such joy at his presence. "Hello, little lady. Did you have a good day with Miss Penelope?" Emma babbled happily, patting Mason's bearded cheek with one hand while maintaining a firm grip on Penelope's finger with the other, physically connecting them as a unit. The significance wasn't lost on either adult. Mason's eyes met Penelope's over Emma's head, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that whatever their individual pasts held, their present had become inexorably intertwined. As autumn painted the landscape in fiery hues, Penelope found herself thinking less about what she'd left behind and more about what might lie ahead. Emma was walking confidently now, her vocabulary expanding daily. The bond between them had deepened into something Penelope had never expected to feel again, the fierce, protective love of a mother. The thought terrified her. She wasn't Emma's mother. She had no right to those feelings, no claim to the child's future. Yet each time Emma reached for her, called for Pen in her sweet voice, or fell asleep in her arms, the walls Penelope had built around her heart crumbled a little more. And then there was Mason. She caught him watching her sometimes, his blue eyes thoughtful. He was unfailingly kind, respectful of her boundaries even as he occasionally tested them with gentle questions about her life. He included her in decisions about the ranch, valued her opinions, and treated her more as a partner than an employee. One crisp October morning, Penelope was hanging laundry while Emma played with wooden blocks nearby when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. 2 riders were coming up the lane, the sheriff from Prairie Rose and a well-dressed stranger. Penelope's blood ran cold. Instinctively, she scooped up Emma and hurried inside, her heart pounding. Through the window, she watched as Mason emerged from the barn to greet the visitors. The conversation appeared cordial, with Mason gesturing toward the house at one point. When the front door opened minutes later, Penelope was sitting in the rocking chair, Emma on her lap, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "Penelope," Mason said, his expression unreadable. Sheriff Donovan is here with a Mr. Harrison from St. Louis. They'd like to speak with you. She clutched Emma tighter, earning a protesting squirm from the child. The well-dressed man stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Martin," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education. "My name is James Harrison. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Edward Martin." Penelope's face drained of color. "My father is dead," the lawyer nodded. "3 weeks ago. A heart attack. I've been attempting to locate you since then." Sheriff Donovan shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Harrison contacted my office asking if anyone matching your description had passed through. When I mentioned you were working out here, he asked me to make an introduction." Mason moved to stand beside Penelope's chair, his presence solid and reassuring. "What does this mean for Miss Martin?" Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Martin made significant changes to his will shortly before his passing. Miss Martin has inherited a substantial portion of his estate, including property and investments." Penelope felt dizzy. "That's impossible. He disowned me." "Yes, well," Harrison looked genuinely remorseful, "your father regretted his actions in his final months. He attempted to locate you himself but was unsuccessful." A terrible suspicion dawned on Penelope. "Does Frederick know about the will?" Harrison exchanged a glance with the sheriff. "Your brother contested the will immediately, but the courts upheld your father's wishes. Mr. Frederick Martin is displeased. He's looking for me," Penelope whispered, more statement than question. "I believe so," Harrison confirmed, "which is why I've been trying to reach you first. You need to be aware of your rights and the resources now available to you." Mason's hand came to rest on Penelope's shoulder. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation once Miss Martin has had time to process the news of her father's passing." Harrison nodded. "Of course. I'll be staying at the hotel in Prairie Rose for 3 days. These papers explain everything." He placed a leather portfolio on the side table. "My sincere condolences, Miss Martin." After the men departed, Penelope sat frozen, Emma squirming to be released. Mason gently lifted the child, setting her down with her toys before kneeling before Penelope. "Talk to me," he said quietly. The concern in his eyes broke something in her. Months of fear, secrets, and loneliness suddenly overwhelmed her, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "My brother will come for me," she whispered, "and he'll destroy anyone in his way." Mason took her trembling hands in his. "Tell me everything from the beginning," and so she did. How her mother had died when Penelope was 16, leaving her at the mercy of her cold, demanding father and resentful older brother. How Frederick had controlled her every move, intercepting letters from suitors, isolating her from friends. How her father had arranged a marriage to one of his business associates, a man 40 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty toward his previous wives. "I refused," Penelope said, her voice stronger now. "For the first time in my life I stood my ground." Father was furious. "He gave me an ultimatum: marry Bartholomew Winters or be cut off without a penny." "So you ran," Mason concluded. Penelope nodded. "I took my mother's jewelry, sold what I could, and headed west. I've been traveling for nearly a year, staying nowhere more than a few weeks, afraid Frederick would find me." Her eyes found Emma, who was contentedly stacking blocks. "Until I came here." Mason was quiet for a long moment. "And now your father has left you an inheritance that Frederick believes should be his. Frederick has always been obsessed with the Martin fortune. He managed my father's businesses, expecting to inherit everything. He'll see this as the ultimate betrayal by father and by me. What will you do?" Mason asked. "Will you go to St. Louis to claim your inheritance?" Penelope looked around the modest farmhouse that had become more of a home than the grand mansion she'd grown up in had ever been. "I don't know. I need time to think." Mason nodded. "You have time. And you have a place here for as long as you want it." The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, after Emma was asleep, Penelope sat at the kitchen table examining the papers Harrison had left. The inheritance was indeed substantial enough to provide independence for the rest of her life. but claiming it meant confronting Frederick, possibly engaging in a protracted legal battle. Mason joined her, setting a cup of tea at her elbow. Any answers in those pages? Too many and not enough, she said with a sigh. I never wanted my father's money, I just wanted freedom. And now I have responsibilities I never expected. She looked up at him. I should leave, Mason. Frederick is dangerous if he tracks me here. Running didn't solve your problems before, Mason pointed out. What makes you think it will now? Penelope's fingers traced the legal language detailing her inheritance. What other choice do I have? I can't put you and Emma at risk. Mason's hand covered hers, stilling her nervous movement. You could stay and face him, not alone but with people who care about you at your side. The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Penelope searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his steady gaze. Why would you risk yourself and Emma for me? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Because in the months you've been here, you've become part of our lives, Mason answered simply. Emma adores you, and he paused, seemed to gather courage. I've come to care for you, Penelope, more than I thought possible after Clara. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Mason, I'm not asking for anything, he continued quickly. I just want you to know that whatever you decide, you're not alone anymore. Tears pricked at her eyes. I've come to care for you too, she admitted, both of you. That's why I can't bear the thought of bringing trouble to your door. Mason's fingers tightened around hers. Some things are worth fighting for. The next morning, Penelope woke to Emma's familiar babbling through the monitor Mason had rigged between their rooms. As she tended to the child, feeding her breakfast and dressing her for the day, Penelope's mind kept returning to Mason's words. Some things are worth fighting for. For years, she'd been taught that a woman's value lay in her obedience, her willingness to sacrifice her own desires for family duty. Running away had been her first act of rebellion, choosing freedom over security, uncertainty over guaranteed misery. But now, looking at Emma's trusting face and thinking of Mason's quiet strength, Penelope realized she'd found something she hadn't been looking for. A chance at genuine happiness, at a family built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Her decision crystallized as she watched Emma toddle across the kitchen floor to greet her father as he came in from the morning chores. Mason swept his daughter up, his face lighting with joy as the child planted a sloppy kiss on his cheek. When he looked over at Penelope, the warmth in his gaze included her in that circle of affection. This was worth fighting for. I'm going to Prairie Rose today, she announced. I need to speak with Mr. Harrison. Mason set Emma down carefully. Have you decided? Yes. I'm going to accept the inheritance, but on my own terms. I won't let Frederick intimidate me anymore. Pride flickered across Mason's features. I'll ride with you. 2 hours later, they sat in a private room at the Prairie Rose Hotel, Emma contentedly napping in a makeshift bed constructed from chair cushions. Harrison spread documents across the table as Penelope outlined her conditions. I want to establish a trust for Emma, she said firmly. And I want to invest in Mason's ranch, a formal business partnership. Harrison raised his eyebrows but made notes without comment. Additionally, Penelope continued, I want to use a portion to establish a fund for widowers and orphans in Montana Territory. The rest I'll manage myself, but I have no intention of returning to St. Louis. Your brother won't be pleased, Harrison warned. He's already making inquiries about your whereabouts. Let him, Penelope said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. I'm done hiding. Mason's hand found hers beneath the table, his silent support bolstering her resolve. As they rode back to the ranch that afternoon, the landscape stretching endlessly before them, Penelope felt lighter than she had in years. Decisions had been made, papers signed, plans set in motion. For the first time, she was charting her own course. Do you think I'm being foolish? She asked Mason as they crested a hill overlooking his property, standing my ground instead of running. He reined his horse to a stop, turning to face her with Emma securely held against his chest in a specially made carrier. "I think you're being braver than most men I know," he said honestly, "and whatever comes, we'll face it together." The first snow fell in early November, transforming the ranch into a glistening wonderland. Emma was fascinated by the white flakes, squealing with delight as Penelope held her up to catch them on her tongue. Inside, the house was warm and fragrant with the scent of baking bread and stewing meat. Mason watched from the doorway, his heart full at the scene before him. Over the past weeks, the boundaries between employer and employee had blurred further as Penelope had begun investing in the ranch. New equipment had arrived, repairs long postponed were underway, and plans for spring expansion were taking shape. But more significant were the changes in their personal relationship. Evenings were spent in easy conversation after Emma was asleep, sometimes playing chess or reading aloud from Mason's modest library. Penelope had opened up more about her life in St. Louis, sharing memories of her mother and stories of her childhood before Frederick's controlling nature had darkened everything. For his part, Mason had found himself able to speak of Clara without the crushing grief that had once accompanied her memory. Penelope listened without jealousy or impatience, understanding that his love for his late wife didn't diminish what was growing between them. And something was indeed growing: tender glances that lingered, hands that found reasons to touch, a deepening intimacy that remained unspoken but increasingly undeniable. That evening, as they sat before the fireplace, Emma having been tucked into her crib hours earlier, Mason found himself studying Penelope's profile. The firelight cast a warm glow on her features, softening them and highlighting the contentment that had replaced the hunted look she'd arrived with. "What are you thinking about so intently?" she asked, catching his gaze. "You," he answered honestly. "How different you are from the woman who showed up on my doorstep." She smiled. "I feel different, stronger." Her eyes met his. "Happier." Mason reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I never expected to feel this way again," he admitted quietly. "After Clara died, I thought that part of my life was over." Penelope's breath caught. "What way?" "Like I've found a partner. Someone who makes me want to be better, work harder, dream bigger." He paused, gathering courage. "Someone I could love." The word hung between them, charged with possibility. "Mason," Penelope whispered, her free hand coming up to touch his cheek. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her. They pulled apart, startled by the intrusion at such a late hour. Mason rose, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver he kept on a high shelf. "Stay here," he instructed, moving cautiously to the door. When he opened it, Sheriff Donovan stood on the porch, snow dusting his coat and hat. "Evening, Mason," he said grimly. "Sorry to disturb you, but I thought you should know Frederick Martin arrived in town today. He's asking questions about his sister." Penelope had come up behind Mason, her face pale in the lamplight. "He's here," the sheriff nodded. "At the hotel. Seems mighty determined to find you." "Did you tell him?" Mason asked sharply. "Course not." Donovan looked offended. "Just said I'd pass along that he's looking, but Prairie Rose ain't that big, Miss Martin. Won't take him long to hear talk." Penelope wrapped her arms around herself. "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff." After Donovan departed, Mason secured the door and turned to find Penelope staring into the fire, her expression resolute rather than fearful. "He won't stop," she said quietly. "Not until he gets what he wants." Mason moved to stand beside her. "What do you want to do?" She looked up at him, determination hardening her delicate features. "I want to end this, once and for all." She took a deep breath. "Tomorrow, I'm going to town to face my brother." The morning dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow sparkling under a brilliant blue sky. Penelope dressed with care, selecting her finest dress, a deep blue wool that complemented her auburn hair. She arranged her hair in a neat chignon, pinned with the pearl combs that had been her mother's. Mason watched her preparations, concern etched on his face. "Let me come with you." She shook her head. "This is something I need to do myself." Seeing his expression, she added more gently, "But I would appreciate it if you could bring Emma to town later." There's something I need to show both of you after I've dealt with Frederick." Reluctantly, Mason agreed to follow in the early afternoon with Emma. As he helped Penelope into the buggy he'd readied for her journey, he pressed something into her hand, a small Derringer pistol. "Just in case," he said quietly. Penelope tucked it into her handbag without protest. She understood the realities of the frontier better now than she had months ago. The ride to town gave her time to rehearse what she would say to Frederick. All her life, she'd feared her brother's temper, his cutting words, his manipulations. But the woman riding confidently toward Prairie Rose was not the same sheltered girl who had fled St. Louis in terror. The town was quiet when she arrived, just beginning its day. Penelope tethered the horse outside the hotel and straightened her shoulders before walking inside. The clerk at the desk recognized her immediately. "Miss Martin," he said, clearly flustered. "Your brother is having breakfast in the dining room." "Thank you," Penelope replied with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "I'll join him." The hotel dining room was nearly empty at this hour. Frederick sat alone at a corner table, his back to the wall, always positioning himself to observe rather than be observed. He hadn't changed much, still immaculately dressed, his dark hair carefully styled, his posture rigid with the self-importance he'd cultivated since childhood. He spotted her immediately, his coffee cup freezing halfway to his lips. For a brief moment, surprise overtook his features before they settled into a cold mask. "Well, well," he drawled as she approached. "The prodigal sister returns." Penelope took the seat opposite him without waiting for an invitation. "Hello, Frederick," he set down his cup with deliberate precision. "You've led me on quite a chase, Penelope, hardly befitting a Martin." "I stopped being concerned with what befits a Martin the day father tried to sell me to Bartholomew Winters," she replied evenly. Frederick's eyes narrowed. "Always so dramatic. It was a respectable arrangement. It was a prison sentence." Penelope signaled a waitress for coffee, taking satisfaction in her brother's momentary confusion at her composure. "But that's not why I'm here. I understand father changed his will." Frederick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A temporary madness brought on by his illness. "His legitimate heir will contest it successfully, I assure you." "You've already contested it and failed," Penelope pointed out. "Mr. Harrison informed me of the court's decision." "Harrison found you then." Frederick's voice was dangerously soft. "And yet you didn't return to St. Louis to claim your ill-gotten gains. Curious." Penelope accepted the coffee brought by the waitress, taking a measured sip before responding. "I've already claimed my inheritance, Frederick. The papers were signed days ago." Rage flashed across his face, quickly controlled. "And what do you intend to do with money you have no idea how to manage? Squander it on dresses? Donate it to whatever frontier charity has captured your fickle attention? Actually, I've already made investments, quite profitable ones." She met his gaze steadily. "I've learned a great deal about business in my time away." Frederick leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little fool. That money is Martin money built by generations of Martin men. You have no right to it. Return to St. Louis with me now, sign it over, and perhaps I'll allow you some small stipend." Penelope didn't flinch. "No," the single word hung between them. Frederick's face flushed with anger. "You always were stubborn," he snarled. "Do you think I don't know what you're doing here? Playing house with some dirt-poor rancher and his brat? Is that your plan, to throw away your heritage on these savages?" Now it was Penelope's turn to lean forward. "Mason Zachary is twice the man you'll ever be," she said, her voice low but intense. "And Emma is the child I adore with all my heart. They've given me more in a few months than you or father ever did in 23 years. Frederick's hand shot across the table, gripping her wrist painfully. "You think you can hide from me here? I have connections you can't begin to imagine. One word from me and your precious rancher might suffer an unfortunate accident. Cattle die. Barns burn. Children get sick." The threat against Emma ignited a fury Penelope hadn't known she possessed. In one fluid motion, she extracted the derringer from her handbag and pressed it against Frederick's thigh beneath the table. "Remove your hand," she said quietly, "or I swear by our mother's memory, I will shoot you where you sit." Frederick's eyes widened in genuine shock. He released her wrist, sitting back slowly. "You've changed," he said, a new wariness in his tone. "Yes," Penelope agreed, returning the pistol to her bag but keeping her hand near it. "The West does that to a person, separates the strong from the weak, shows you what really matters." She stood, looking down at her brother with pity rather than fear. "I'm not the frightened girl you bullied anymore, Frederick. I own controlling interest in father's companies now. I've already instructed the board about certain irregularities in the accounts you've been managing. They're quite interested in discussing them with you." The blood drained from Frederick's face. "You wouldn't dare." "I already have. The telegram went out yesterday." Penelope dropped several coins on the table for her coffee. "You have two choices. Return to St. Louis immediately to face the board's questions or be arrested for embezzlement. Either way, you'll leave Montana territory today and you'll never threaten me or those I love again." Frederick stared at her, hatred and something like fear mingling in his eyes. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." Penelope's voice held the finality of a closing door. "Goodbye, Frederick." She walked out of the dining room with her head high, not looking back. Outside, the winter sun was bright, the air crisp and clean. Penelope took a deep breath, feeling as though she'd shed a skin that had grown too tight, too confining. She had one more task to complete before Mason arrived with Emma. With determined steps, she made her way to the town's small church, where she had asked the preacher to meet her. By the time Mason drove into town with Emma bundled against the cold, Penelope was waiting on the church steps. She wore a different expression than when she'd left the ranch that morning, a radiant certainty that took his breath away. "Is everything all right?" he asked as he lifted Emma from the wagon. "Your brother is no longer a concern," she assured him. "He'll be on the afternoon stage." Mason searched her face. "You're sure, completely?" She reached for Emma, who went willingly into her arms. "But that's not why I asked you to come." She took a deep breath. "I have something to ask you, both of you, actually." Mason's heart quickened at the serious tone in her voice. "What is it?" Penelope adjusted Emma on her hip, her eyes never leaving Mason's. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. I've found a home here, not just a place to live, but a place where I belong." Her voice grew softer. "With people I love." "Penelope," Mason breathed, hardly daring to hope what might come next. "I know it hasn't been that long," she continued. "And I know your heart still holds Clara's memory. But I was wondering, hoping." She faltered briefly before finding her courage again. "Would you consider making me a permanent part of your family, not just as Emma's caretaker or your business partner, but as something more?" The joy that surged through Mason nearly overwhelmed him. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" A blush colored her cheeks. "I suppose I am. It's terribly forward, I know." "It's perfect," he corrected, stepping closer, "and my answer is yes, 1,000 times yes." Emma, sensing the importance of the moment, patted both their faces with her little hands, babbling happily. "There is one thing," Penelope said, suddenly hesitant. I can't have children, an illness when I was 17. The confession cost her visibly. "I should have told you sooner." Mason's expression softened. "You think that matters to me?" "It should," she insisted. "A man needs sons to carry on his name, his legacy." He took her free hand, bringing it to his lips. "What I need is you. What Emma needs is a mother who loves her. The rest is just details." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes. "I've loved her from the first moment I held her," she whispered. "But I worried. I thought perhaps you'd want a wife who could give you more children." Mason shook his head firmly. "I want you, Penelope Martin, just as you are." She blinked back tears, a smile breaking through. "Actually, that's another thing I wanted to tell you. I'm not Penelope Martin anymore." Confusion crossed his features. "What do you mean?" "I've legally changed my name," she explained. "Part of breaking ties with my past. I'm Penelope Montgomery, now my mother's maiden name." Penelope Montgomery, Mason repeated, testing the name. It suits you. His smile turned playful. Though I was rather hoping you might consider becoming Penelope Zachary soon, her answering smile was radiant. I was hoping you might say that. 2 weeks later, on the first Sunday in December, the small church in Prairie Rose witnessed the union of Mason Zachary and Penelope Montgomery. Emma, dressed in a tiny white dress sewn by Penelope herself, was an integral part of the ceremony, held in Mason's arms as they spoke their vows. The reception that followed at the town hall was the social event of the season. Everyone from the grizzled old-timers to the newest settlers came to celebrate, bringing food, music, and well wishes. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Mason held Penelope close, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought her to his door. "Happy," he murmured against her temple. "Beyond words," she replied, her eyes shining. "I never imagined this kind of happiness was possible." Later, as the celebration continued around them, they found a quiet moment in a corner. Emma had fallen asleep in the arms of the storekeeper's wife, who had happily volunteered to watch her while the newlyweds slipped away for a honeymoon at her resort in the mountains, another gift from Penelope's inheritance. "You know," Mason said thoughtfully, "you never did tell me the whole story of how you ended up on my doorstep that day." Penelope's expression grew reflective. "I was at the end of my rope, nearly out of money, exhausted from running." She smiled at the memory. "The storekeeper mentioned a widower with a baby and something just called to me, as if a voice was saying, 'This is where you're meant to be.'" "Divine intervention," Mason suggested, "perhaps." Her eyes found Emma across the room. "When I first held her, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever, hope, but I was so afraid of growing attached, of being hurt again." She looked up at her new husband, vulnerability crossing her features. "The day you asked if I would stay permanently, I almost refused." Mason looked surprised. "You never told me that." "I was terrified," she admitted. "Not of you or of life here, but of my own feelings. I told myself I wasn't fit to be anyone's wife, too damaged, too broken by my past." "What changed your mind?" Penelope's expression softened with the memory. "Emma was fussy that night, remember? You were trying to calm her, walking the floor singing that terrible off-key lullaby." Mason chuckled. "I remember. You looked so exhausted but so determined. I offered to take her, but you said something I'll never forget." "What was that?" "You said, 'Sometimes a child needs their father's arms even when mothers would be softer.' And then you looked at me and added, 'She thinks of you that way, you know, as her mother.'" Mason nodded slowly, recalling the moment. "You went very still." "Because it hit me then, I already was a mother in all the ways that mattered. I'd been fighting it, denying myself that identity because I thought I didn't deserve it or wasn't qualified for it somehow." Her eyes glistened. "But love doesn't require qualifications, does it? It just asks that you show up day after day with an open heart." "And you did," Mason said softly. "You do." "Later that night," Penelope continued, "when you finally handed her to me, she was almost asleep. I whispered that I wasn't fit to be her mother, that I was too flawed, too scarred by my past." "And what did Emma say?" Mason asked, playing along though he knew his daughter had been too young for such a conversation. Penelope's smile was luminous. "Nothing, of course. But you were standing in the doorway. You whispered, 'Then be the mother I've prayed for,' and in that moment I knew this was where I belonged. With you, with Emma, building a family that heals rather than hurts." Mason pulled her close, his heart too full for words. Around them, their friends and neighbors celebrated their union, but in that moment, they existed in a world of their own, making a world built on second chances and unexpected blessings. Spring came to the Zachary Ranch with a riot of wildflowers and new beginnings. The cattle thrived on fresh grass. New foals wobbled beside their mothers in the expanded pastures, and the house itself had grown with the addition of 2 new rooms. On a warm afternoon in late May, Penelope sat on a colorful quilt spread beneath the old oak tree that shaded the front yard. Emma, now nearly 2, was carefully arranging a collection of pine cones and smooth stones. her dark curls so like her mother Clara's bouncing with each determined movement. From her vantage point, Penelope could see Mason working with the ranch hands to repair a section of fencing. His shirt was off in the heat, his skin bronzed from hours under the Montana sun. Occasionally he would look up, finding her with unerring accuracy, and smile a private communication that still sent warmth coursing through her. 6 months of marriage had deepened their connection in ways Penelope hadn't imagined possible. Mason was a passionate, tender husband who made her feel cherished and desired. Together, they had transformed the ranch into a thriving enterprise while creating a home filled with laughter and love. Frederick had indeed departed on the afternoon stage that November day, but not before making one final, desperate attempt to intimidate her. The confrontation at the stage depot had ended with Sheriff Donovan suggesting that Frederick would find the return journey far more comfortable without a bullet in his leg, a suggestion Frederick had wisely heeded. Word arrived from St. Louis 3 months later that Frederick had fled the country one step ahead of fraud charges, reportedly sailing for Europe with whatever funds he'd managed to salvage. Penelope had felt an unexpected pang of sadness for the brother who had never learned that true wealth had little to do with money. Her reverie was interrupted by Emma tugging at her skirt. "Mama," the little girl said insistently, offering a particularly interesting rock. "Look, it's beautiful, sweetheart," Penelope said, accepting the treasure with appropriate solemnity. "Shall we add it to our collection?" Emma nodded vigorously before returning to her exploration of the yard. "Mama." The word still brought a lump to Penelope's throat. Emma had begun using it around Christmas, and each time felt like a gift. Mason had encouraged it from the start, telling Emma stories about her two mothers, the angel mama who had given her life and the earthly mama who had chosen her with her whole heart. A shadow fell across the quilt, and Penelope looked up to find Mason standing over her, sweat dampened and grinning. "What are my two favorite ladies doing?" he asked, dropping down beside her. "Cataloging the natural wonders of the Zachary estate," Penelope replied with mock seriousness, gesturing to Emma's growing collection of outdoor treasures. Mason laughed, the sound still one of Penelope's favorite things in the world. He stretched out beside her, propping himself up on one elbow. "I was thinking," he said, his tone casual but his eyes intent, "that the house is starting to feel a little empty with just the three of us." Penelope's breath caught. They discussed the possibility of adoption but had agreed to wait until Emma was a bit older. "What did you have in mind?" she asked carefully. Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded letter. "This came yesterday while you were in town. From the orphanage in Helena. They had donated generously to the institution from Penelope's inheritance, establishing a fund to improve conditions and provide education for the children there. They have twins," Mason continued, unfolding the letter. "Boy and girl just turned 4. Their mother was a widow who died of pneumonia last month. No other family." Penelope took the letter with trembling hands, scanning the details. "They want to keep them together." "Of course," Mason agreed, "which makes placement difficult. Most families only want one child, not two at once." He watched her face closely. "The director thought of us because of our donations, said we should consider it if we were so inclined." Penelope looked over at Emma, happily talking to herself as she arranged her treasures. "What do you think?" she asked softly. Mason's hand found hers on the quilt. "I think our home has room for more love. I think Emma would make a wonderful big sister, and I think you were born to be a mother, Penelope Zachary, whether by birth or by choice." Tears welled in her eyes. "When can we go meet them?" His answering smile was brilliant. "I was hoping you'd say that. I told the ranch hands I might need a few days away next week." Penelope threw her arms around him, laughing through her tears. "I love you, Mason Zachary, more than I ever thought possible." He held her close, his voice rough with emotion. "And I love you, Mrs. Zachary, for giving me a second chance at happiness, for loving Emma as your own, for building this life with me step by step." From across the yard, Emma spotted their embrace and came running, launching herself into the middle of their hug with the abandon of complete trust. As they sat together on the quilt, planning their trip to Helena and imagining their family's expansion, Penelope marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From a frightened young woman fleeing tyranny to a confident wife and mother creating a legacy of love, a transformation as vast and beautiful as the Montana sky stretching endlessly above them. In the distance, a rider approached the ranch hand returning from town with the mail. Soon there would be letters to read, decisions to make, details to arrange. But for now, in this perfect moment, Penelope simply held her family close and gave thanks for the unexpected gift of belonging, of purpose, of home. The mother she had become was not defined by biology or bloodlines, but by the daily choice to love, to nurture, to protect. It wasn't the life she'd been born to, but the one she'd fought for, the one she'd chosen with her whole heart. And in that choice, Penelope had found freedom more profound than she'd ever dreamed possible.